hidden. Okay. So, this is actually the start of 3D modeling in Blender. Now, I have to make some assets for my game, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make assets and just talk about the process. What you do, how you do it. And this is going to be the second part of chapter 0.1, which is going to be Blender Basics. So, your Blender. This is literally, well, this is what I have set up as my open, because when you set it up, when you open Blender, it'll start with a cube, a camera, and a light source. I got rid of the camera and the light source, and then I went up here to this. You go to File, and then Defaults, and you save Startup. So whatever changes you make, it will save that. This Blender file will be my default. So every time I open Blender, it'll open to this. I saved it that way. You don't have to do that. You can literally just use the basic Blender setup. There's a lot of customization in Blender. You can make your own workspaces. So you can set up certain things in certain ways. Like my standard shading editor this is the regular default one because I had a different one that was set up. But you can edit this and resave it, and that will be your new shading editor for when you come back in. So there's a lot of customization you can do, but when you open Blender, it'll open to this screen, which is the layout. I do a lot of work in layout just because it's nice, and honestly, most of the time, I just get rid of that. If you go to the border of any of your little windows, and you right-click, you get join areas, swap areas, vertical split, horizontal split. Of course, vertical and horizontal is going to bring up a little line. When you do that, it splits into a new window, and then you can set these new windows to whatever you need them to be. Certain things in 3D viewports will carry over, so if I change settings in this, it will change some settings in this, but I can use this to view like my full render or my test render. I can change the visual settings in this. How do I know how to do this, I swear. There we go. Yeah, you bring in your like background worldview stuff, and that won't affect this. But it's like niche case stuff, like stuff you want to do. I've used it a couple times for certain things. But when you split the screen, you'll get a new box. Up here, these are your different tabs, basically. These are your different editing windows. So text editor, you can just make a text document in this explaining certain things in your blend file. Image editor for editing image files. You can do all sorts of things. So you have your generalized views, and then next to each of the little buttons in here, so even in this one, which is the outliner, there's this, which displays different views inside that main window. So the outliner has your scenes, your view layer, your video sequencer, Blender file, which is really useful for stuff. It displays all the actual data inside the different file types inside a Blender file. The most common one is your view layer, which shows what's in your 3D viewport and stuff. In here we have view, paint, and mask. Masking is for masking images. Paint is when you're painting a 2D image. So there's stuff like that. Each of these windows, each of these editor windows has sub-windows in it. The major ones you're going to need to know, of course, are the 3D viewport, the image editor. UV editor is pretty important, but it's more in-depth, so we'll get to that at a later point in the series, of course. We have... I'm actually trying to think of what we have. Texture node editor is not the one I use. I use the shader editors because shaders are your textures and stuff. So shader editors for editing materials and all that. Animation stuff, everything in the animation thing is important for animation, but only for animation. So if you're only doing 3D modeling, if you're just making static models, you don't really need to worry about the animation tabs. I wouldn't if you're starting out. Animation is definitely going to be its own section. It's a very big, broad section, so you need to like really get into it and understand a lot of stuff. So Dopesheet, Timeline, Graph Editor, those are your three pretty big, important ones. Drivers and nonlinear, I don't really touch too much. I can get by with the Dopesheet. The Graph Editor is really important. Timeline tends to be pretty useful. Scripting is for, of course, you have your text editor. Python console, you can make documents. You can make code documents in this stuff to make your own add-ons and stuff. Haven't really touched that. But you've got your 3D viewport. The basics you need are the 3D viewport, your outliner, and your properties. And since I... Oh, Jesus. Whoops. Since I don't need this, you get it so it shows the little double arrows. Right-click and join areas, and then it shows you this. And you can just swipe around and join the zone so it's one viewport again. Manage your space, manage your windows, because when you set these up properly, it eases the process of Blender. It eases the process of going in between stuff. Definitely not the first thing you do. In the beginning, just use the defaults because it's a little easier to understand once you know what you're actually getting into. But once you get far enough, you can and should start editing your window setups so that they're fitted for what you're doing. So, of course, you can go through these, look at them, get used to them, understand the different modes. The 3D viewport has special modes, like if you select an object, then it gives you the actual general options for that object, and if you use different objects like a skeletal rig or an armature, it'll give you other options. So definitely we'll get into those as they come up, but for now, pretty good idea, just like work with what you got. And in the beginning, you really only need this, and very quickly in the beginning you'll learn that you'll probably need some properties stuff up, because the properties of your objects and of your 3D world are really what start affecting how stuff comes together. And you can see, like selecting nothing, those didn't pop up, and then as soon as I hit this, these tabs popped up, which are the properties of the object. So your properties tab, the little slider bars, properties and data, those are important. Your view window, your outliner for your view layer is pretty useful, especially in the beginning, to understand what's here. But you generally only use this for like naming objects, finding objects, organizing subsets of a 3D world. So when you're setting up like level design, game development stuff, when you're setting up a level, you might have multiple versions of that level, or you might have multiple objects that all need to be in a level, but you don't need a bunch of copies of them in the 3D modeler. You just need to make them so they're scaled correctly. You can make them in collections in the view layer and name them all so that you know which parts are which. It's very useful for animation stuff. It's very useful for level design stuff. But when you're getting into the beginning of it, all you need it for in like the major component is naming your objects, because you should always name your objects. Yes, Kevin. Always name your objects. Like this. I'm going to name this wood board, and I'm going to name it board. I'm going to name it wood board, and I'm naming it wood board because I'm going to make this a wood board, and I know I'm going to make it a wood board. The other thing you can do, either in a text editor on this or in a regular notebook, so it's a little bit separate and you can do things in a notebook that you don't want to do in Blender, writing out and planning the actual models you need to make. Figuring that out ahead of time can help a lot, because you may not know right away what objects you'll need for what you're making. So I actually have, not with me, I left it somewhere, but I have a list of the objects that I need for the model that I'm going to be making, and that comes up when you do go to save file. So here's another thing. When you start a Blender file, it doesn't save anything. Like if I take this cube and I do some basic edits, like I take this top layer and I extrude it and I scale it, and I take this one and I rotate it, this is now an edited object. But if I close this Blender file, nothing's going to save. And actually, if I try to close it, it gives me a warning saying, save, don't save, cancel. Do you want to save this blend file, or are you just using it to experiment? So make sure you save, and make sure you name your saves, because that will be very crucial for organizing stuff, especially for game development. If you are making game-ready assets, it is a good idea to keep several separate files so you don't have overcrowding in one file of a bunch of stuff you're sorting through, especially when scales are different and all that. But the other thing is, save your files and name them appropriately so they're easy to find and easy to like re-edit in case you need to in case you need to do stuff later for a model, having that model, especially important models, in a specific place in your computer and naming them appropriately so you can find them is really important. So what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to hit Control S. It's going to boot this up. I'm going to go ahead and make sure this is in the correct place, and it's completely not. So if I go to this one, my Grease Project library, and I go to Asset Library, because that's where I keep all my Blender models. Don't do what I did. I made a mess of files, but I did that because I wanted to. I like it this way. Trust me. So I'm going to go to the place where I want to save this particular blend file. Of course, it's going to give me trouble for a minute. Let this load, and then I'm going to name it and save it right away, just so I have the blend file to start with, so I know where it is. And this becomes really useful when you start referencing models to blend files when you're looking for specific models for your game engine. You want to know where those models came from, so having a named structure really helps. So, the only other thing I have here is the factory office for the game I'm working on, and I'm currently going to make Haunted Log Mill. And this name is not like the name used in game, or it's not the name that is referenced in game when you play it, but it's probably the name that I'm going to use in the files for all the actors and all the objects that go with the Haunted Log Mill, which is one of the major levels. So I'm giving it this Haunted Log Mill name because I'll remember it, and when I'm looking for models that are related to the Haunted Log Mill, I'll know they're either in here or they're attached to that blend file. However, when I move them to the game files, I'll probably separate them out and move them to the individual sections where they need to be, like static actors, animated actors, and all that. So, name your stuff, name everything, name all your stuff. Like this collection, I'm just going to name this Log Mill Building, because all the pieces of the actual building structure I'm going to put there. I don't tend to rename the first one, leave Scene Collection as Scene Collection, but in that, make sub-collections and use those to organize all your files and all your objects, because it will get easier. Don't put skeletal rigs and animated models in a collection with all your static models, because your static models are static, and trying to find individual bones inside a skeletal rig in an object in a collection that's already full of other objects will be a headache. So do this. Just keep your stuff separated. So I'm going to use this file for all the static parts that are the building blocks of the actual building that I'm making, which is what we're going to do for the actual modeling part of this. So now that we've covered some of the basics of like Blender in general, of all your different, like the different places you can go, these are all predefined, predetermined tabs. But you can, like I said, you can make these. These can be made by setting up these windows and saving them. With that said, in the beginning, for modeling, for the section we're about to start, all you need is your 3D viewport and your properties. And if you want to keep your stuff named like you should, pull up your outliner with your view layer and use that to name stuff, or you can name it in the properties of all the objects. But keeping track of all those names is easier with the outliner. So these three tabs, or these three windows, are all you really need to start modeling, and that's what we're going to get to now.